Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stevenson, the Odd Man. He'll unpack wisdom and insights from a cross-section of top quality performers in business, media, sports, entertainment, and lifestyle to uncover key elements to help you live your best audacious life ever. So without further ado, here is the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations. I'm Audley Stevenson, and this is the Audacious Living Podcast. You also know it by the most audacious podcast on the web. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you for taking the opportunity to check us out. You know what our goal is, because it hasn't changed, it remains the same, and it's to help you live your best audacious life ever. As always, I encourage you to stay connected to us through our social media channels. We're on Twitter and Instagram under the handle, The Audacious Pod. And then on Facebook, it's the full podcast name, The Audacious Living Podcast. And then, of course, you also can subscribe to our YouTube channel and get notifications and alerts sent to you each and every time new content comes out. So please do connect, like, follow, subscribe, share, tell a friend. Let's keep the good news rolling. The topic of today's conversation is all about the power of intuition. And our guest is Sunil Godse, and he'll join the podcast to help us not only just broaden our understanding of what intuition is, but also give us some insight as to why it's so important that we listen to it. Now, our intuition is there with us every step of the way and present itself each and every single time we're in a scenario when we have to make some kind of decision. Maybe it's life altering, maybe it's small, big, whatever, but our intuition is always there. Now, we all have some level of intuitiveness inside of us, but we're not necessarily using it to its full potential. Things like being a good judge of character or being able to read a room when you enter it, they're kind of all good indicators that you're in tune and you're on the right path. I think the challenge for most of us is that we're not always connected with our intuition because we're not necessarily paying attention to the signs and signals when they hit us. And I can assure you they are there. Sometimes they're as quiet as a whisper, or in other cases, they're like a boulder smacking us on the side of the head. You're going to hear from Sunil, and he says it himself, and he'll explain his work in this field. But he's done a ton of research, studying, understanding, and really absorbing what intuition is. He's interviewed over 1,000 successful professionals and entrepreneurs to get their take on what the topic of intuition is and how it's played a key role in their lives. He's written a book called Gut, and he also speaks professionally internationally. Plus, he's got an intuitionology podcast, so he definitely knows a thing or two about this thing called intuition. I tell you, it's an absolutely wonderful conversation. We had a great time, but my intuition tells me that you're absolutely gonna love it. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Sunil Godse. Enjoy. Our intuition plays a key role in our daily decision making, and whether we realize it or not, that instinctive feeling is always there to guide and direct us. Sunil Godse is an intuitive branding coach whose success is entirely built upon the foundation of intuition. Godse helps individuals increase their understanding of intuition, recognize the reasons why we ignore the signals and not follow them, and the steps needed to make better decisions. Sunil is up next on the Audacious Living Podcast. So first off, Sunil, I really appreciate you taking the time of being on the podcast today. I've been really looking forward to talking to you about intuition, what it means for our lives. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely, no problem. I'm really happy to educate your listeners on what trusting intuition really is, and giving them some steps that they can do, what they can do today to start that process.
Gotcha. I wonder, is just to set up the table here, if we can sort of give a definition of what intuition is. I know the term, trusting your gut kind of falls into that. If you can let's start there and we can frame things nicely.
Yeah. So this, it's a bit of an odd question in that, and I'll tell you why it's odd. This was one of the first things that I started to do when I realized about intuition and why I couldn't find a common definition. Of course, there's the online dictionary versions, and I went through 3 or 4 online dictionaries that didn't resonate with me. When I started looking at the research, it was about manifestation, voices from God, living in the present moment.
Right.
All of those type of things that really didn't resonate with me. And so the way that I looked at it, and this will be a little bit more important when we look at the research, I saw it as an art and a science, a blend of art and science. So the art part were these, what I call quote unquote, somethings or signals, as I now know about. And these signals were the ones that kind of guided me to make the right decision versus the wrong one. And we'll get into the nature of the signals. Oh. And then the science part will also dive in because it's kind of back to my engineering days. And I really like kind of, if you look back at even things like steel has matter-like properties and has like wave-like properties. And so I really saw intuition from that lens. And so the reason why there's no set definition is because science has shown that it hits the amygdala. The amygdala is the primitive part of our brain. Okay. There's no language around it. And so what happens is we put our own language around it. And so that's why a lot of the things that I looked at from other people's lenses didn't resonate with me, because it wasn't my language in understanding what intuition is. And so when I look at, and this is one of the questions I asked my interviewees, and I've had over 1,000 now for my podcast series. And one of my first questions is, how do you define intuition? And it almost always comes down to a feeling. So now I've got over 1,000 people kind of confirming the same thing. And it's basically, I mean, the research is showing the same thing as well. So it's a great question. And it's a little bit more of a complex question, because that's the same thing I tried thinking about when I started my journey in really understanding what is this thing called intuition.
Got you. No, well, and it's when you start talking about this feeling thing, it's now very abstract, right? Because it's different for everyone. And at the end of the day, I think everyone will kind of go back to that feeling word, because that's the best way they can articulate that. But I think that's what makes it really interesting, right? Because we're all talking about the same thing, but we can't define it, right?
Yep. Absolutely. And you're right. And because it's such an individual thing. So there's, the good thing is it's an individual. The thing that I would be cautious about is that we all gravitate to common language around it, like this gut feeling or this voice. And so that's great to have these common, what I call signals. But the thing with signals is they're actually a little bit more complex than we think. And they all start and stop at different areas. So for example, negative signals they actually start very subtle in nature and they get louder. Okay. So let's say you and I agree on a common voice, for example. Okay. That voice for you could be signal number 1, which is great because the intuition is sending you a signal and then you're just going to start acting on that decision, it says. For me, that could mean that's signal number 3. And if it's signal number 3, that means that I've ignored 2 decisions because I've ignored 2 signals. Right. So that could be the difference between either stubbing my toe somewhere or I'm headed towards bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Right. Because I don't know how big the decisions are that I missed.
And missing, I think I like the usage of that word miss, because it was there. We just either weren't paying attention, we were distracted, didn't recognize it, whatever. It could be any of those things. But really what you're saying is they always were there the whole time.
They're always there. And so any situation you find yourself in, any decision you make, your neurons are going to hit that amygdala, and it's fight or flight, right? And so obviously it's going to be either a saber-toothed tiger coming to eat you, or it's going to be singularly focused, like think, trust, do, move. Right. And again, now I'm putting language around things that are just to illustrate sort of just how primitive it really is in some sense, and how it's just the first thing that has to happen before you do anything in terms of thoughts, behaviors, or actions. Your intuition is the precursor to all of that.
Got you. now, so we're talking about signals. You mentioned there's 4 different types of signals, or there are various?
Yes. Yeah. So we get into, so there's 4 types of intuition. We can get into that. But typically with the signals, there's going to be a basket of positive signals and a basket of negative signals. And the positive signals are the ones that are typically like, for example, the dots connecting. For me, that's what it is, or it feels like a flow. And so when those signals come up, then it means that I should be making that decision or taking that action.
Right.
A couple of the ones that are really kind of out there that I've had from those I've interviewed in my podcast series, Danielle Doucette's, she's a singer-songwriter. She sees an orb. There's an actual ball that comes up that she notices. And another CEO, he runs a multinational clothing company for men's suits. He sees an omen. And so he can't describe it. There's no shape. But whatever he's doing, if he's hiring someone or is in a business deal and this omen pops up, it's like, yes, what you're doing is correct. And so he'll just stop whatever he's doing and say yes to whatever he's thinking or whatever he's working on. Now, if you get into the negative signals, the one thing about negative signals is that they actually, all of them start really subtle in nature.
Yes.
And then they get louder and louder, particularly the negative ones, until they start tapping you on the shoulder and say, okay, listen, I'm trying to tell you something here. And so for example, some people talk about that anxiousness or that gut feeling, hairs in the back of your neck standing up. And one of the more weird ones is I was interviewing an entrepreneur and he didn't even know what his signals were. But yet when we started to talk about the failures that he got into because of the ventures he got into for the wrong reasons, his left earlobe kept getting hot and he kept grabbing his left earlobe. And then he just said, Sunil, I just realized that one of my intuitive signals and one of the louder ones was this left earlobe getting hot. And now he remembers looking back when he got into these ventures, he kept grabbing his ear. And when he was talking to his wife about these ventures, he kept grabbing his ear. So that's how specific it can get. And if you think about it, your experiences are going to be different than mine. We're all born with intuition.
Right.
Yeah. And as we age, we go through all these unique experiences. So this is where it's really important that we find out what our inventory of positive signals are and what our inventory of negative signals are. And it's okay to have common ones, but we don't know, again, which number it is and what type of environment that we're making the decision in. So again, I can come back to, let's say, the dots connecting, and let's say you and I share that one as well. So for you, that can be a professional situation where maybe it's a job offer that's right for you. For me, it's a particular friend that I'm looking to come in a personal situation. And so therefore that means that positive signal means that friend is someone I can bring closer. So again, this is where that specificity comes in. And where we've come with intuition is this general language about gut feeling or the voice, and we kind of run with it, right, which is excellent because everybody's coming through this common knowledge or common language. But again, because there's no language about it, this just seems to be something that everybody gravitates to. It's absolutely abstract, right? But the issue with that being abstract is now we have some tangible benefits to people who ignore intuition. Like, some of them are getting into bankruptcy, losing $80,000, losing their job, and going homeless or becoming bankrupt. And now we have some sort of tangible situations that people go through, all related to missing the signals that they had at the very start. And then that's when it's too late.
Right. So I'll tell you what I find really interesting about this piece, because in the world of business, as example, you gave some really good examples.
Yep.
In the business world, decisions are oftentimes made on hard facts, hard numbers. This is what happened last quarter versus all those sorts of things. But now we're saying, no, listen to the abstract piece that we can't really listen to that gut feeling. And it flies in the face of like everything we know to make your decisions on, like the hard facts.
Well, and these numbers are great, but they're also what I call laggard indicators. So when you're looking at, let's say, your quarterlies or your P&L statement or your balance sheet, these are reflections of what has happened. Okay. And what has happened is the processes that you put in place. But even before that, it even comes down to, how did you treat your employees, right? And there's that intuitive relationship. So if you don't treat your employees properly, then they're going to seem like you don't really care. They're going to not be productive, and they're not going to be productive. Your revenues are going to suffer. If your revenues suffer, that hits their P&L. and a very interesting case. And this is now where I get into the complexity, and I'll talk about the 4 types of intuition.
Yeah.
This is a non-believer. So this is one of my first interviewees was an investment banker, data-driven heavy. And this guy, 30 years in the business of investment banking. And so I asked John, I said, John, I'm talking about intuition. Would you give me an interview? And he goes, Sunil, look, I don't think intuition exists, but I'll give you an hour.
Okay.
And we'll talk about intuition for 5 minutes. And then, we'll catch up. I haven't seen you in a while. So we'll have a latte for the last 55 minutes.
Sure.
So I go down and I'm just thinking on the way down, okay, this better be a good trip, a fruitful trip. So I turn on the cameras and it's very clear that he's saying, and I'm telling him about this CEO that sees omens. And he says, you know what, I'd like to shake the hand of the person who sees omens. Intuition just doesn't affect anything in business decisions. It just doesn't happen. Right. And he's shaking his head and he's very skeptical and he's being very nice to me. Mm-hmm. And so and then he says, business is all about, like you say, there's data, learning, and experience. And I said, oh, but John, one of the 4 types, and his name is John Rothschild. John, one of the 4 types of intuition is actually called experiential intuition. Right. And experiential intuition looks at, like, you're born with intuition. And there's been studies that have shown that infants as young as 2 months old have shown to have intuitive tendencies, or as they called it in the paper, intuitive physics. Okay. So as you age, all these experiences get accumulated but get put in the subconscious area of your brain, like a library.
That's right.
And so there's this library of experiences, both good and bad, both formal and informal, like street knowledge, of yours and others that you know of that you notice. So it's gathering billions and billions of pieces of data points. Yep. So when you're going to make a decision, all that data that's related, all the experience related to that decision is already plucked from the subconscious and in a split second handed to you on a silver platter saying, you've already done this, you've already been there. So therefore, I'm going to give you a positive signal to move you forward. And in some cases, your intuition will tell you to go against the data. And then John perks up and he says, well, that's funny. I have a situation just like that. And I said, okay, John, tell me what happened. So this is a guy who opened up franchise locations. Okay. And so on a franchise location, they use a benchmarking system. 9 out of 10 means that they open one up. So just like for Wendy's or Tim Hortons or whatever. And so now we're getting into the second of the 4 intuitive types called situational intuition. Mm-hmm. He and his partner walk into this area that they were thinking about putting in a franchise. His team was looking at it, and the franchise was clearly a 5.5 out of 10. Okay. But he's just looking around and says, there's something that's telling me that we've got to put something here. It was a dilapidated part of Toronto. There was nothing really that made it, obviously, when they looked at traffic patterns and everything, nothing pointed to something that they should put. And he says, I think we should put one there here. And they did. And that ended up being the most profitable restaurant portfolio in that whole portfolios they had, called the Beer Market. So now John's warming up to the fact, and he's now saying, perhaps it was intuition. And now he's kind of convincing himself. And so he's talking about story after story about hiring, about teamwork. And now he's seeing the realization of how intuition plays a real role, because he's telling me his stories and he's seeing how intuition's played out. And you can almost see him convince himself.
Yeah.
And at the very end, after 1 hour, the last question I asked him was, John, have you done something so crazy that people thought you were nuts? And this is called creative intuition. Mm. And he says, oh, Sunil, I have a story for you. And I said, well, tell me that. Okay. So this is a guy probably making $3 to $4 million a year, high-end restaurants, limousines, private jets. Okay. His intuition now, he was saying, was telling him to leave that corporate job and go run a tiny bankrupt little restaurant. And he goes to his wife and he says, this just feels right. There's the signal that he is now I'm quoting exactly what he said. Right. So now he recognizes the signal telling him that this is the way to go. The 4th of the 4 is called relational intuition. The relational intuition looks at the people that you need to listen to when you make that decision. Everybody concerned with money, ego, fame, all said, John, you're nuts. Because they never bothered to ask him what he really wanted. Right. He really wanted to run this. He didn't want to be a coach on the sidelines. He actually wanted to run a business. Yep. And everybody was saying, you're nuts. But relational intuition is saying, listen to the one person that really knows where you want to go, what your purpose is, and who really cares for you in moving your life forward. And there was only one person, that was his wife. And his wife said, yes, John, do it. And he did. He quit. He rolled up his sleeves, walked into that tiny bankrupt restaurant. That restaurant ended up being Eastside Mario's location number 1. Wow. And that ended up being over 20 years. He grew that into over 1,000 locations, wow. Over $2 billion in revenues before he retired, all because of an intuitive moment, an intuitive decision that he talks about. That's the power of intuition. That's how it does. And now I've taken a non-believer into a complete believer, sure. Showing all the 4 types of intuition and the signals because it was his we were talking about definition earlier. Yep. It's his definition that he understood. He understood it not from spirituality and voices from God. Mm-hmm. He understood it from experience and feeling right. And so that's exactly how he needed to think about it. So in that hour, when he's talking about his experiences, his intuition, his stories, I'm just shining a light saying, well, it's actually intuition is a common thread here. And after an hour, he gets it.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Did you get your latte, by the way? I mean, that's the other question I had.
Yeah, no, I think we got some cheap coffee, so it wasn't really good. No. But that cheap coffee kept me awake. That's like, this is so bad. I'm really attentive.
No, it really is. That in itself is a powerful story because when you start to, and it certainly sounds like in your conversation with John it starts by, again, him being a non-believer, but almost talking himself into it as he's starting to recognize or realize that these signals were there. And that's kind of what leads me to my question around listening, because I wonder oftentimes is it a function of not recognizing or just choosing not to hear them.
Yeah, and there's a couple of the reasons why we ignore our intuition. One is, you're right, the signals. So what happens is we're just not, because we gravitate to these really common terms, we don't really take the time, nor we don't even know that intuition is so complex. And it's like driving a car is what I take a look at. When you drive a car, you turn the crank or you press the button and you hear the engine, which are the signals, but you don't often pop the hood up to really kind of look at how the car, you just drive. Yep. And so that's okay, but you have to know a little bit more about the engine, right? So the engine sounding rough or is it smooth? And nobody's really looked at intuition as deep as I have, because I really needed to understand it for myself. And I remember when it comes to these signals, I distinctly remember when I was 5 years old, there was these video games that I wanted to buy. My dad said, sorry, they're too expensive. Okay. There's this voice that told me, Sunil, you need to go door to door to raise money. And so here's this 5-year-old kid going door to door. I raised $200, lots of milk and cookies. Oh, wow. And $100 went to my dad and $100 went to charity because my school was doing that at the time. And then when I reflected back to some others, these signals that came up, I remember, because I'm East Indian, there's basically 4 career doors that you have as an East Indian male. It's going to be doctor, lawyer, engineer, or failure. So luckily I picked door number 3. Right. My dad was an engineer and I hated it. And so I spent 3 years in an engineering career I didn't like. 2 years into that 3-year stint, there was a Mexican restaurant that was coming up. It was a big chain. And I was asked to be a private investor with that. And so I said yes. And pretty soon I was making 5 times more in dividends with that restaurant than I was as an engineer full time. Right. So in my 3rd year, I said, sorry, I got to go. But I remember that something was telling me this is the right opportunity. I then got into a management consulting contract because from entrepreneurship, like I had 4 or 5, six businesses, 20 million in revenues. Then I started consulting for other businesses. And there was this one contract in Silicon Valley, huge. The numbers were amazing, big IT company. And I couldn't believe it. But the contract terms kept changing. And again, there's this signal that was telling me, back off. Yet I was so emotionally tied to that contract that I said, no, I got to go. And I spent every single penny going down there and the company didn't pay me. and I came back up to Canada with 25 cents in my bank account. And the last one, which was the most devastating for me, was I was doing some coaching while in engineering.
Okay.
And one of my friends was trying to reach out to me because she was being stalked by some guy, and she really needs some advice. And so, there's something the signal was telling me, you got to meet with her that afternoon. But for some reason, I wasn't busy. I said, let's meet a couple of days later.
Right.
And the very next day, that same guy walked up to her in a bus shelter and pulled a bullet through her forehead and killed her. And so this was the catalyst for me to really understand why was it that I ignored these signals? What was this thing called intuition? And that led to, again, the definition that we talked about earlier. That led to really opening up, opening the hood and finding, okay, how does this thing work? How does this car tick when it comes to intuition?
Gotcha.
And so one of the reasons is when we don't pay attention to these signals and we don't spend the time to think about in the past, like this is where your listeners can start today. If they look back, what worked in terms of decisions, what didn't work, and what did it feel like, and then write them down, and then keep thinking about those incidences. So I've got one signal, but was there a decision before that I ignored? Right. And you keep going until you get back to that first decision. And now what you have is you've got a basket of positive signals and you have a basket of negative signals. And so now you know that the next decision that you make is going to be the right one because you've got the positive, negative signals coming in. So that's one reason why people ignore their intuition. The other reason is that people, again, have this sense that they're talking about intuition. Right. They think that they're living their life with positivity and mindset and all that, but they're not living it. And so a friend of mine, Hal Eisenberg, was someone I met, and he was in the mindset space. Okay. I was in the intuition space. So naturally our paths crossed, and we talked a lot about this stuff, but he didn't really understand the extent or the depth of how complex intuition was until he saw me speaking in Toronto. And he just said, wow, there's these signals. I didn't know that. These 4 types of intuition. That's really interesting. And so that's when he just said, we continued talking. And then all of a sudden, one of these intuitive signals popped up. He developed a cough, and his intuition, now that he recalls, was saying, go to the hospital. And he ignored that, and he ignored it again until he actually ended up going to the hospital and ended up contracting the COVID-19 virus. He ended up fighting for his life. He had a life or death moment. He himself actually wanted to die. That's how bad it got, in just for fighting for one breath. And then he realized, he said, my intuition came to me and said, your voice needs to be heard. You are not done yet. It was just clear, crystal clear. As to what he needed to do once he left that hospital. He obviously lived. 5 days later, I was one of the first ones he told in depth about what had happened. He was my very first podcast guest for my Intuitionology podcast series. Yep. And he now recognizes, he said, I was talking about mindset and all that stuff, but I wasn't living that. I'd say I'd make some decisions. It's this, it's that. Intuition's this, it's that. He never fully embraced what it really meant to live in the moment. And the last reason why you ignore your intuition is that generally there's some kind of trauma in your past, or you've gone through some really devastating situations. And what happens is when you start to lose your purpose, you start to forsake your values become weaker. And when that happens, there's 4 intuitive hurdles that really squash your signals. And so when you don't trust yourself, there's 2 hurdles that really impact you. One is you become too emotional. Right. Because you hijack the amygdala. And then there's the other one is fear. Mm-hmm. You're too fearful of making a decision. So it's a fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of failure. And even though your intuition is telling you to go in a certain direction, right, you don't, because you just don't trust yourself. And then when you don't trust yourself, sometimes you trust other people. You put your values in other people's hands. And that's where the other 2 hurdles come. One is being too rational. Too rational is when you're following societal's rules, you're drinking the Kool-Aid, but your intuition
like logic, you mean? Kind of.
Yeah. So let's say, for example, I'm an East Indian male. So logically, I should be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. Gotcha. Even though my intuition is saying something different. Or the fourth one is called ego, and there's 2 sides to ego. Ego is of course your narcissistic self, sure, but the other ego is following the herd. So, you have friends in your life just because maybe there's something you like their brand, they're associated with somebody famous, or there's an intention that is going really against your values, but you're sticking with these people, even though you know they're caustic for you or they don't really move your life forward, but you're too afraid to let them go. But your intuition is signaling that you shouldn't. And so of those four, the biggest one is fear. And again, we're talking about the amygdala. It's not the fear of the saber-tooth tiger. It's the fear that your intuition is saying this. You've got a positive signal saying you need to go that way, but you don't trust yourself. And the best analogy I have is a fellow David Dame, who is he has cerebral palsy, and he was in his wheelchair all his life, and he got an opportunity to go on vacation and live a dream, which was just have the sand caress his toes in the ocean water. So his friends wheeled him up to the edge of the sand and the water barrier there. He steps in the water, and he falls flat on his face. And he says, Sunil, I have two things I can do at this point. I can succumb to the fear and sit back in the wheelchair and forever regret that I've never been able to live the dream that I can actually live right now. Or I can trust my intuition to take the one step. Even though I fear, my intuition saying do it. Take one step into the water, then another step, and then another step. And then he points to his neck and he says, the water gets to about here. And then he looks back. And when he looks back, he hasn't realized how far he had come. And that's how you live life on intuition. That's how you live life in the present moment. That's how you live life listening to your signals. It doesn't matter about the water. It doesn't matter about what other people are saying. This is your path, your decisions, your success. Who cares? What about anybody else? And something I commonly say is this is my train. I'm on this track and this is the speed that it's going. If you don't like it, get off at the next station. And if you continue to bother me, I'm going to kick you out myself. And that's the way that you should be living life, garnering success from an intrinsic perspective. Gotcha. Don't hang your head on square footage and Ferraris and gold. The success will come as long as the intention behind that is measured by, and if you're going to be buying something, you get a big house because it's a symbol of success, or you just want other people to look at you. Right. And everyone, although they may say something internally, your intuition knows what exactly your intuition is. And a lot of times we don't want to have that discussion, right? Because we like that ego. It gives us that dopamine hit. Yes. Feels good, not to your intuition. Right. And that now you're starting to ignore it.
The one thing as you're talking sort of, again, on an intuition, I almost, you got that, so that you talk about the angel on either side of your shoulder sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Your intuition always wants the best for you, but there's sometimes it's sort of, you could get steered in the, maybe not, in a situation where it's not so good. Is that common?
Yeah. So when people come to me, and I've got several people who've talked about intuition leading them down the wrong path, and the way that they characterize it is that sometimes intuition needs to teach you a lesson. Gotcha. So for my premise is intuition is never wrong. It's never going to steer you in the wrong direction. Okay. And so when I look at the story that they're laying out as to what had happened, because I get them to go into as much detail as they can about the story, more often, every single time, it's one of those four hurdles that I discussed that impacts them because their values are low. They've lost their purpose, or they're in a really bad time in their life. They're not paying attention to their intuition. Great example of this is I had Mark Metry. He has the Top 100 Humans 2.0 podcast series. He was on one of my earlier interviewees, and he got into social anxiety in high school. He almost took his life because he felt that he needed to lie again and again and again. Right. So he was saying, so intuition sometimes leads you down the wrong path because it got me to XYZ. And so I said, okay, hold on, Mark. When I was listening to your story, but if you take the story that you were telling me just now and we rewind the podcast interview, which I've done a couple of times, when you started telling me that story, first of all, he didn't have a self-identity. He felt that he needed to lie to become part of a group. So he didn't have any self-worth. Right. When he had no self-worth, those hurdles came, especially ego, came and really bombarded him, and it silenced his intuitive signals. Then when he starts to tell the story, he says, I knew I shouldn't have lied, but ... And I said, Mark, the moment you said I shouldn't have lied, but that's exactly where your intuition was.
Right.
You chose to ignore the signals. You chose to lie again and again and again. And you chose to, almost chose to take your own life. And obviously, thankfully, intuition helped him out of that. And obviously he lived, and he's doing wonderful things with this podcast series.
Amazing. You know what? It's one of the reasons why I was so looking forward to have you talk about this on this podcast. On this podcast, we talk a lot about being bold, audacious, and going out and taking bold risks. And oftentimes it's that intuitive part of our brain that's saying to us, "Here's what we've got to do." I mean, I vividly remember the sort of conversation I was having in my head when I was talking about starting a podcast. Well, why do you want to do that? There's lots of them out there already. There's more, there's more noise in the space. But clearly, it's something that I had to do, and I follow that to intuition and that voice. Yes. So that very much is in line with what we're talking about here, because I feel that once we listen, and you get your thoughts on this, but when we listen to our intuition, we're actually giving ourselves to move in that space of greatness where we're destined to be.
Absolutely. And it's a self-selection process for other people around you. That's how you filter your relationships. So those who you really surround yourself with are really in tune with you. I talked about the analogy with my train. And so that what happens is when you have that purpose, you know where you're going, just like John Rothschild, the only person out of thousands of people he knew was his wife that said, open up that bankrupt tiny little restaurant. Everybody else was so concerned with how it looked or giving up the Mercedes or whatever it was.
Right.
And so when you self-select these people out of your life, it's hard. It appears to be hard is what I'm going to say.
Right.
The reason why I say that is because it's not hard when you get good at listening to your intuitive signals. There's that self-confidence that comes in. It's like, you're gone. So for me, it's not that hard.
Right.
Initially it is there because there's the emotional ties. And when you surround yourself with people who are there for you during the ups and the downs, these aren't yes people. These are people that are going to give you the constructive criticism, but they really care about where you're going, what your purpose is, and they'll be there as a source of support. And when you have that source of support, it actually lifts you even better because it's a great foundation for you. And those that aren't part of your inner circle, or you don't allow them to, they're going to self-select themselves out.
Right.
And I don't want caustic people around me and my family.
Right.
And so if they don't want to be friends with me, good on you. Good luck. I wish you luck. And some people change, right? And it's an ebb and flow. So some people are great friends. About 6 years ago, we let go of another family. I have no clue what happened. But somehow their values had shifted, and I saw some behaviors I really didn't like. And intuition already gives second chances. I was not about to give a third. And there was a very, very important event in my life. And my wife even asked, she says, do you want to invite them? After I was pretty emphatic that I didn't want them again in our lives. And I said, absolutely not. I've given them chances, second chances. I've given them a third chance, even by calling them, let's get together. And something had changed in their lives. They've moved on. And I really don't care to find out because it doesn't concern me. And I don't want, that's not a dot that I need to put on top of the I or across the T.
Sure. Something
happened. Excellent. I'm going to move this way. And I'm just going to keep living life every single day, trusting my intuition. Good luck to you.
Got you. Makes total sense. Sunil, I've really, really enjoyed and appreciated the things you had to say and enjoyed this conversation. And one last thing I want to ask you before we go is along the line. So, you got a listener that's taking this all in and is intrigued and this is great stuff. What is a starting point to getting better at listening to intuition, or maybe sharpening your skills around that? What is a starting point for individuals?
Absolutely. And so I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So the first thing is to really take stock of your signals. And so go back to those decisions that you've made in the past, good and bad, and really take an inventory of what those signals are. And so I have this, it's a free 7-day challenge you can get from my website. And what that 7-day challenge basically does is that you come up with a problem that you want to solve. It can be anything.
Okay.
And the first thing that you do when you solve that problem, one of the first things you do is to take a look at what didn't work. And so this is it's a very specific process. So if you knew what didn't work, then you've got negative signals associated with it. Then you take the time to figure out, okay, what's going to work? And then when you look at what's going to work, now you're getting your positive intuitive signals. What's important about that process is if you put in let's say something that you think might work to solve your problem, and now you've done your homework for a negative signal. Once that negative signal comes up saying, that's not one that you got to put on that list, that's when you discard it. And so that way you've got a really good list of things that you're going to plan to do. And then you take action. And one of the things I do in that 7-day challenge is I measure your strength, intuitive strength, on a percentage basis before and after. And I'd have over 54,000 people now through it. 100% of the time, the intuitive strength has increased. And so that's the best starting place. And now you have a template of moving your life ahead with the sheet that you can download and reuse for every kind of decision that you make, any kind of problem you want to solve, without even having to deal with me at all. And so that could be a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know. But again, if you want to take that further, then I've got accelerated programs, and there's some one-on-one stuff that we can do. It all depends on the severity of what people are trying to get out of. If there's some real trauma in their lives, then I'll work with them one-on-one to get rid of that, so that they don't get stuck in the past. Because when they have trauma in the back, they're stuck, emotionally stuck there, and they're not giving their intuition that chance to release that.
And the trauma is a good point, because that for a lot of people, and perhaps there's emotion attached to this trauma. Yeah. And emotion sometimes can throw our intuition off as well, because you're so caught up in that emotion piece, you don't even hear their voice or see the signs or recognize the signals. So that's a big one as well. Yeah, absolutely. And intuition is a balance of head and heart, right? A balance of emotions and rationality. And so you've got the lead up with the logic part, with all the experiential intuition that you have. That emotion is the one. If you're too emotional, you're minimizing the logic. And now you're really running something on emotions, and now you're guessing, right? You're kind of rolling a dice that, okay, maybe this is the right direction, and praying that it's going to work. But if the logic is saying, or somebody else is saying you shouldn't, and you trust that person, now you're going to go against your intuition, and now you're starting to make one decision, and that could morph into second one, and now you're down a path you don't want to go down. Real good point. Sunil, this has been great. Where can our listeners catch up with you and get more insights and learn to beef up or bone up their intuition? Absolutely. So intuitionknowledge.com, and there's a 7-day challenge, link to the 7-day challenge there. I would suggest you start there. I'm all the social channels, TikTok. I'm going to try TikTok. I'm not going to dance, because everybody's intuition is going to say, I'm going to unfollow this guy so quickly. But I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and they can DM me on any of those. Shoot me an email at sunil@sunilgodse.com, and happy to answer any questions. Awesome. Sunil, I really appreciate this, man. Thank you for being here. Back we are here on the podcast, and big thanks to Sunil for the insights on intuition and explain why it's so important to our day-to-day lives. That intuitive guidance system that we all have inside, it's built into us, and it comes from that unconscious place of knowing. And the tough thing for many to accept is that there's no real concrete data to support the way you feel, because it's just that. It's the way you feel. And that's why it's so easy to ignore at times. But if there's any one thing that you remember after you walk away after hearing my words, it's this. There's nothing wrong with not knowing why you feel the way you do in the moment. Embrace that feeling in your gut. Trust your inner voice and make the decisions with a boldness and audaciousness that only you can. Okay, maybe that was more than just one thing, but you get the point. Hey, listen, if you haven't registered for email notifications of the podcast, you certainly can do so by heading over to bestaudaciouslife.com. You can enter your email address, and every single time there's a new content that becomes available, you will be alerted in your inbox via an email. Thanks as always to our listeners for spending some time on the Audacious Living Podcast. It's so much appreciated. Love your support. And again, I can't say enough how much you are a big part of this. So thank you. And hey, let's throw one more thank you in there. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, show love to one another, and be audacious.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by Audley Stevenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.